My name is Amber Townsend. I was 32 years old the night my mother called me, at 2 a.m., with a condition for attending my own brother's engagement dinner. Just keep your mouth shut, she said. No greeting. No how are you? No concern about the 7-hour drive I'd just finished. Just another list of instructions, as though I were still an 18-year-old girl who couldn't think for herself. Her explanation came quickly. Kyle's fiancé's father was a retired U.S. Army colonel, highly decorated, and Mom was convinced I'd somehow embarrassed the family, just like she always claimed I did. I sat alone in the darkness of my hotel room, smiled to myself, and quietly answered, "Understood." Then I ended the call. My eyes drifted toward the closet. Inside hung two very different versions of my life. On one side was the black dress I'd bought for the dinner. On the other hung my army dress blues, complete with a captain's rank on the shoulders and 3 deployment patches sewn onto the sleeve. What my mother either didn't know, or never cared enough to ask, was that the same colonel she was so desperate to impress had personally pinned a medal onto my uniform 3 years earlier at Fort Campbell. She had no idea, because she had never once asked about my career. And what happened around that dinner table is exactly why I'm finally telling the story. Welcome back to Diana True Stories, the place where we share unforgettable stories about family betrayal, hidden truths, and the moments people finally decide they've had enough. If Amber's journey feels familiar, leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. But before we get to that dinner, let me take you back to the phone call that started everything. Earlier that afternoon, I'd driven 7 hours from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to Roanoke, Virginia. 7 long hours filled with mountain highways, roadside coffee, and too much time alone with my thoughts. All just to sit across a dinner table with people who clearly wished I hadn't come. Around 9 p.m., I checked into a Holiday Inn just off the interstate. I showered, unpacked, and out of habit, set my alarm for 0600. Then, at exactly 2:07 a.m., my phone lit up.
Mom.
When your mother calls in the middle of the night, you answer. Because your first thought is always that something terrible has happened. Someone must be dead. But nobody was. Instead, she said, "Tomorrow, you can come to dinner with Kyle's fiancé's family, but keep your mouth shut." Her voice carried that familiar sharpness, the tone she used after rehearsing every word beforehand. I asked her why. She answered without missing a beat. Her father is a decorated colonel. Don't embarrass us like you always do. Like I always do. As if she'd spent years collecting every mistake I'd ever made, carefully filing each one away for future use. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed wearing an old t-shirt and running shorts, holding the warm phone against my ear. "Okay," I replied. She disconnected immediately. She always did. I placed my phone on the nightstand and stared across the room. The dress blues hung on one side of the closet. The black dress hung on the other. 2 completely different versions of the same woman, standing side by side inside a cheap roadside hotel in the hometown where I never truly felt like I belonged. 14 years earlier, I'd stood in our kitchen on Brambleton Avenue with an Army enlistment contract lying on the counter while my mother's face turned pale. Dad had already been gone for 2 years, taken by a heart attack at only 51 while working his shift at the paper mill. Mom had just started running a small catering business from our kitchen. The counters were covered with trays of deviled eggs, pulled pork sliders, and catering supplies stacked beside my enlistment papers. She needed another pair of hands. She needed me to stay. Kyle was only 14 and couldn't even manage a serving tray. "I raised you to stay here," she told me, "not to leave." I tried to explain that joining the Army wasn't about running away. It was about creating a future that belonged to me. Something I could build with my own effort. Something no one could hand me, and no one could ever take away. She never heard any of it. The morning I left for basic training, I loaded my duffel bag into the trunk of a taxi just before 6 a.m. Mom stood silently on the porch in her bathrobe. She didn't hug me. She didn't wish me luck. She simply said, "If you walk out that door, don't expect me to wait." I walked out anyway, and she kept her promise. For the next 14 years, every holiday visit felt less like coming home, and more like sitting through an annual performance review I'd already failed. Lorraine Townsend, my mother, treated me like an unexpected guest. Always polite, always distant, always cold enough to hurt without leaving visible scars. Kyle figured out the rules early. He stayed home. He helped with the catering business. He answered every phone call before it rang twice. In my mother's math, staying meant love. Leaving meant betrayal. But I never left to punish her. I left because staying would have cost me the person I eventually became. Morning arrived. My alarm rang at 6 a.m. I spent 30 minutes doing push-ups and planks on the hotel carpet since the fitness room didn't open until 7. After that came black coffee from the lobby machine. Then I called my unit back at Fort Campbell to check on the supply manifest for an upcoming training rotation. Nothing was urgent. Still, I checked in. That's who I am. Routine keeps me steady. Routine is the framework that holds everything together whenever life starts falling apart. At 8:15, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Kyle. Dinner tonight. 7 p.m. Beach House Grill. Dress nice. And Amber, just smile.
Don't talk about the Army.
It makes people uncomfortable. I read the message twice. The Army. As though 14 years of service, 3 overseas deployments, an Army Commendation Medal, and managing the logistics that supplied 3 forward operating bases in Helmand Province were nothing more than an odd little hobby, like collecting stamps. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the closet again. The uniform remained on the left. The black dress waited on the right. I chose the dress, not because I was embarrassed by the uniform. I never have been. But because this evening belonged to Kyle, not to me. Showing up in dress blues would have shifted every eye in the room toward me. And that was never why I'd made the trip. The only reason I had driven those 7 hours was simple. In 60 days, I'd be deploying again. Before that happened, I just wanted to sit across the table from my brother one more time and see his face. Nothing more. Around 10 a.m., another text arrived. This one came from an unfamiliar number. I opened it. Hi, Amber. I'm Megan Hart. Kyle gave me your number. I'm really looking forward to meeting you tonight.
He's told me so much about you.
Just one thing. My dad is pretty traditional, so let's keep dinner light and fun, okay? He's not a fan of heavy conversations. I stared at the message. Kyle's told me so much about you. Those words carried more weight than she realized. The only question was, what exactly had he told her? I called Kyle immediately. He answered after the 3rd ring. His voice sounded overly cheerful, the forced kind he used whenever he was trying to keep everyone happy.
Hey, Amber.
What's up? What have you been telling Megan about me? Silence. Not an awkward silence. The kind where someone is deciding exactly how much truth they're willing to spend. Just the basics, he finally replied. I told her you've been traveling, doing your own thing. Then he added, you know Mom doesn't really like all the Army talk. I frowned. Traveling. You told her I've just been traveling? Amber. He sighed. It's just easier this way. Her dad's a colonel. A real one. He doesn't need to hear about. He stopped himself. Too late. About what, Kyle? Nothing. Only silence again.
Long.
Empty. Stretching between us like a deserted highway. Finally he muttered, please just be normal tonight. Then he hung up. I slowly lowered the phone onto the bed. Very carefully. The same way you set something down when you're trying not to throw it across the room. It hit me then. Kyle didn't simply want me to stay quiet. He was embarrassed by me. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because of everything I'd become. A real colonel. As though there were fake ones. Beach House Grill sat on a corner in downtown Roanoke. Stone walls. A burgundy awning. The kind of restaurant where the napkins were cloth and the hostess greeted regular customers by name. We had a private dining room reserved in the back. 12 seats. I arrived at 6:55 p.m. 5 minutes early. The Army teaches you punctuality. And civilian life never quite manages to erase it. Mom was already there. She stood at the far end of the room adjusting a vase filled with white roses. Her back faced the entrance. When she turned and saw me, her eyes traveled from my shoes to my hair in one slow inspection. Like an officer checking a uniform before parade. At least you dressed appropriately for once, she said. No hello. No smile. No you look nice. Just another evaluation. Passing grade. Barely. A few minutes later Kyle and Megan walked in together. Megan was petite, blonde, and smiling with the nervous excitement of someone hoping everything would go perfectly. She came straight over and warmly shook my hand. So you're Amber? It's so nice to finally meet you. Kyle says you've been traveling. Where have you been lately? There it was again. Traveling. The label he'd carefully chosen for my entire life. I smiled anyway. All over, I answered. Which technically wasn't a lie. Just not the kind she imagined. Mom quickly directed everyone toward their seats. Mine was near the opposite end of the table,
6 chairs away from the head.
The place card beside me caught my attention. Colonel James Hart, Ret. I looked at the name again. My pulse rose just a little. James Hart. I knew that name very well. Before the Hart family entered the room, Mom quietly pulled me into the hallway. The carpet was deep burgundy. Soft wall sconces cast warm light across the corridor. She leaned close enough that I caught the familiar scent of the hairspray she'd worn since I was a kid. Listen carefully, she whispered. The Harts believe Kyle comes from a stable family. 2 successful children. I told them you work in hospitality. Hotel management, something like that. If anyone asks, just smile and agree. I blinked. You told them I manage a hotel? She shrugged as though the lie barely mattered. It's close enough. You manage people, supplies, or whatever it is. I looked straight at her. I'm a quartermaster corps officer, Mom. I manage supply operations for 3 forward operating bases in Helmand Province. She dismissed my words with a quick flick of her hand, as if brushing dust from the air. Same thing, just different wording, she replied. Whatever you do, don't correct me in there. Without waiting for my answer, she turned and disappeared back into the private dining room. I remained alone in the hallway for several long seconds. I'd spent years watching my mother minimize my accomplishments. I expected that much. But this wasn't minimizing. This was replacement. She hadn't simply made my career sound less impressive. She had erased it completely. In her version of my life, there was no army, no captain's rank, no deployments, no medals, no years of service. She'd created an entirely different Amber and introduced that imaginary woman to the family of a retired Army colonel. The realization hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't some desperate lie she'd invented 5 minutes before dinner. She'd repeated the story often enough that she'd started believing it herself. Eventually, I walked back inside, pulled out my chair, laid my napkin across my lap, and waited for the evening to begin. As I sat there, one thought kept circling in my mind. She hadn't only asked me to stay quiet. She'd asked me to pretend to be someone else. She'd erased every piece of the life I'd worked to build. If you've ever had someone rewrite your story because the truth made them uncomfortable, stay with me. Everything changes from here. At 7:12 p.m., the restaurant's front door opened. Even from my seat, I heard the old hinge creak. Then came a voice I recognized instantly.
Deep. Calm.
Measured. The kind of voice that had spent decades commanding soldiers who obeyed without hesitation. Colonel James Harland stepped into the private dining room with his wife, Donna, walking just behind him. He wore a charcoal sports coat over a crisp white shirt. There was no uniform, yet everything about his posture announced one anyway. His shoulders stayed square, his chin level. His eyes scanned the room before settling on anyone. Years of military discipline never really leave a person. Donna carried herself with the same effortless confidence. Silver hair, pearl earrings, the composed smile of someone who'd attended more military ceremonies than most people could imagine. Mom hurried toward them before they were even fully inside. Colonel Harland. What an honor! Her enthusiasm was just a little too loud. The colonel smiled politely. Please, he said. Call me Jim. I've been retired for years. He shook Kyle's hand. Megan kissed her father's cheek. They exchanged a few quiet words I couldn't hear. Then his attention drifted around the table.
Past Mom.
Past Kyle. Past Megan's relatives. Until his eyes settled on me. For a second, Maybe 2. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. A slight crease appeared between his eyebrows. It was the kind of tiny reaction you learn to notice when your profession depends on reading people. I knew exactly why. 3 years earlier at Fort Campbell, he'd stood behind a podium, called my name, and pinned the Army Commendation Medal onto my dress uniform. I didn't mention it. I simply gave him a small nod. He returned it. Nothing more. Mom immediately guided him toward the head of the table, and the moment quietly slipped away. The appetizers arrived soon after. Shrimp cocktail, bruschetta, elegant finger food meant to keep conversations light. Mom controlled the dinner exactly the way she managed every catering event she'd ever organized. Everything followed a schedule. Every conversation stayed carefully directed. No surprises. She chatted about Roanoke, her catering business, the local farmers market on Campbell Avenue. Kyle eagerly filled in details wherever she paused. Megan smiled beside him, gently resting a hand on his arm. It all felt rehearsed, like everyone else had received the script except me. Across the table, Donna Harland watched my mother with patient curiosity. She looked like someone experienced enough to recognize when a host was performing for an audience. Finally, she turned toward me. "So, Lorraine," she asked pleasantly, "what does your other daughter do?" The question floated across the table, so casually it almost sounded harmless. Mom answered before anyone else could breathe. "Oh, Amber works in hospitality, hotel management. She travels quite a bit. You know how demanding that business can be." Every word landed harder than the one before it. Hotel management. Travel. That business. I lowered my eyes toward my plate. The shrimp rested quietly on crushed ice. Across the table, Colonel Harlan slowly placed his fork down. He looked at me, then at Mom, then back at me again. He dabbed his mouth with his napkin. But he said nothing. Kyle jumped in almost immediately. "So, Megan," he said with forced enthusiasm, "tell everyone about the reception venue." The conversation moved on. The Colonel's attention didn't. Donna wasn't someone who ignored unanswered questions. Somewhere between the appetizer plates disappearing and the entrees arriving, she looked back at me with the same warm expression she'd probably offered hundreds of young military spouses over the years. "So," she said, "hotel management must keep you busy. Where are you based?" For a brief moment, I considered my choices. I could support my mother's lie. I could expose it completely.
Or
I could walk carefully between both. "I'm based in Kentucky," I answered. "It's fast-paced work. A lot of logistics." "Kentucky." Donna smiled. "That sounds wonderful. Which hotel company?" "It's actually a government operation." The word government settled over the table much more heavily than I'd intended. Donna's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. At the exact same moment, my mother's arm shot across the table toward the bread basket, positioning herself between Donna and me. "Amber," she interrupted quickly, "would you pass the bread, please?" I picked up the basket and handed it over. Donna let the subject drop. Colonel Harlan didn't. From the corner of my eye, I noticed him placing his water glass carefully on the table. Then he studied me with the expression of a man staring at a puzzle he'd nearly finished solving. Government. Kentucky. Logistics. 3 small pieces. Enough to build the picture. He tilted his head only slightly as recognition slowly formed behind his eyes, like dark clouds gathering before a storm, gradual, undeniable, and impossible to stop once it begins. Without saying anything, he slipped a hand into his blazer pocket and took out his phone. Holding it discreetly beneath the table, he began scrolling. I never looked directly. I didn't need to. I knew he was checking something. The main course arrived. Most people ordered pan-seared trout. Kyle, who had complained about seafood his entire life, ordered steak instead. Across from me, Megan had spent nearly the entire evening quietly observing everything. Now she leaned forward, elbows carefully off the table, carrying herself with the discipline you'd expect from the daughter of a career military officer. "So," she asked with genuine curiosity, "what exactly do you do every day?" I glanced toward my mother. She had just lifted her glass, but her eyes immediately locked onto mine over the rim. The warning was unmistakable. Say nothing. I looked back at Megan. I make sure people have what they need, I answered. Food, fuel, equipment, especially in places where getting those things isn't easy. She smiled. Oh, kind of like planning events in difficult locations? Before I could respond, Kyle jumped in. Yeah, basically something like that. I picked up my fork, set it back down, then picked it up again. Something like that, I repeated quietly. Beneath the table, my hand drifted into the pocket of my dress. My fingertips found the familiar edge of a heavy metal challenge coin.
Cool.
Solid. Comforting. Colonel Harland had handed me that coin the same day he presented my Army Commendation Medal. In the military, challenge coins aren't souvenirs.
You don't buy them.
You earn them, or someone you deeply respect chooses to give you one. I never carried mine to impress anyone. I carried it simply because knowing it was there reminded me of everything I'd worked for. Across the table, the colonel looked down at his phone once more. This time, he wasn't scrolling. He stared at the screen without moving. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, just enough for someone trained to notice. Between dinner and dessert, Donna excused herself from the table. As expected, my mother stood immediately and followed her. That was exactly what Lorraine always did. Whenever someone mattered, she made sure to control the conversation. I watched them disappear toward the ladies' room and already knew how it would go. Mom would guide the discussion. Donna would listen politely. And somewhere in those few minutes, my mother would reinforce the imaginary version of me she'd been presenting all evening. Weeks later, Donna herself told me exactly what happened. Standing beside the marble sink, she casually remarked, "Your daughter seems incredibly calm and disciplined for someone working in hospitality." Mom adjusted one of her earrings while looking into the mirror. "She's always been the quiet one," she replied. "Honestly, she never had much ambition. Kyle's the one who's really driven." Donna gently continued. "She mentioned working for the government. Is she managing a hotel on a military installation?" Without even blinking, my mother smiled. "Oh, something like that." Then she added the sentence that still amazes me. "Amber's never been very good at explaining what she actually does. You know how some kids are." Donna smiled politely, but the story didn't fit. After 30 years as the wife of an Army officer, she'd heard enough briefings to recognize when the facts refused to line up. She could sense something was wrong the same way an experienced baker knows bread has failed before it's even out of the oven. When the two women returned to the dining room, Donna leaned close and quietly whispered something into Colonel Harland's ear. I couldn't hear a single word, but I watched his reaction. He closed his eyes for a brief second, opened them again, then looked directly at me. In that moment, I knew he wasn't trying to figure it out anymore. He already knew. I didn't discover exactly what happened until several weeks later, when Colonel Harland invited me to coffee at his home in Blacksburg. But since it explains everything that followed, I'll tell you now. While Donna was questioning my mother, the colonel quietly opened the photo gallery on his phone. He typed one word into the search bar: Townsend. 4 photographs immediately appeared. Every one of them had been taken on the same day, the Army Commendation Medal ceremony at Fort Campbell 3 years earlier. In the first image, he stood behind the podium reading the official citation. In the second, he was shaking hands with a young Army officer. In the third photograph, the one that mattered most, he was fastening the Army Commendation Medal onto the dress uniform of Captain Amber Townsend. My hair was tucked neatly beneath my beret. My shoulders were square. My eyes looked straight ahead. He zoomed in on the image, then slowly lifted his gaze from the phone and looked directly across the dinner table at me. The woman sitting quietly at the end of the table in a simple black dress, the same woman everyone believed was a hotel manager drifting through life. The same face, the same posture, the same calm presence under pressure. Later, Colonel Harland admitted that his first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. He simply couldn't understand why any mother would choose to erase her own daughter's military service. In the world he knew, a world built on sacrifice, deployments, homecomings, and folded flags, a son or daughter who served was someone you proudly talked about. You put military family stickers on your car. You framed every promotion photo. You mentioned their service to strangers in the grocery store. You certainly didn't pretend they worked in a hotel. The colonel quietly placed his phone face down on the table. He straightened his napkin and glanced at Donna. She met his eyes. A silent conversation passed between them, the kind only decades of marriage can create without a single word. Then he waited, because a seasoned colonel understands the difference between forcing a moment and allowing it to arrive on its own.
Dessert was served.
Chocolate torte with raspberry coulis. As Lorraine stood and made her way down the table toward me, she passed behind Kyle, Megan's cousin, and the empty chair where Donna had left her coat. She stopped beside me, leaned close, and whispered into my ear. I could smell the white wine on her breath. "You're doing great," she murmured. "Just keep your mouth shut through the toast, and then we're done." There it was again. Keep your mouth shut. The exact words she'd used on the phone. The same order. The same invisible leash. "I haven't said anything, Mom."
Good.
"That's all I need." I looked directly at her. Really looked. She was 58. Her makeup was flawless. Her pearl necklace sat perfectly in place. But her fingertips trembled ever so slightly, like someone struggling to hold something far heavier than they wanted anyone to notice. "No," I answered softly. "That's not all you're asking. You're asking me to disappear." She lifted her chin. "Don't be dramatic." Then she returned to her seat. I watched as she carefully smoothed her skirt, picked up her fork, sliced a neat piece of chocolate torte, and calmly took a bite. It was the most carefully controlled performance I'd ever witnessed from someone whose entire world depended on never losing control. And in that moment, I understood something I should have realized years before. My silence had never been courtesy. It had never been respect. It had been cooperation. Every time I stayed quiet, I helped protect her lie. Every silent dinner. Every polite nod. Every time I accepted something like that instead of the truth. I had become an accomplice in my own disappearance. Even then, I stayed silent because this evening belonged to Kyle, not me. At the time, that restraint felt honorable. Looking back, it was the final excuse I would ever make for my mother. When dessert ended and coffee hadn't yet arrived, Kyle saw his opportunity. I noticed it immediately. The way he adjusted his tie and leaned toward Colonel Harland as though reaching for an opportunity. "Sir, I'm not sure if Megan mentioned this, but I'm opening an insurance agency here in Roanoke. We'll focus on military families, life insurance, disability coverage, retirement planning. It's a growing market." The colonel listened without interrupting. After 32 years of command, he had mastered the art of listening long enough for people to reveal exactly who they were. "That's worthwhile work," he replied. "Military families are often overlooked." Kyle smiled broadly.
Exactly.
"I was hoping you might know some colleagues who could benefit from our services." The colonel studied him for a moment before asking quietly, "How much do you actually know about military life, Kyle?" The question wasn't harsh. It wasn't loud, but it stopped Kyle immediately. "Well, I've done quite a bit of research. I've read case studies, spoken with a few veterans." "Research," the colonel repeated with a slow nod. Then he turned toward me. Not just a glance. A deliberate look carrying far more than words. He looked at the officer, who had managed supply lines in a combat zone. The woman who had served under his command. The officer who had earned an Army Commendation Medal by keeping soldiers supplied, equipped, and alive under impossible conditions. Then he looked back at the man hoping to sell insurance policies to those very same military families. He shifted his attention back to Kyle. "Research is useful," he said calmly, "but first-hand experience is worth far more." Kyle forced a nervous chuckle. The conversation moved forward, yet the colonel's message had already landed. Anyone paying close attention understood exactly what he meant, including me. As everyone settled into coffee, chairs scraped across the floor as guests traded seats and small conversations began. Donna Harland casually moved into the chair beside mine. It looked effortless, but there was purpose behind it, the quiet confidence military spouses often carry. She stirred her coffee once, then again before speaking. "You mentioned government logistics," she said softly. "And you sit like someone who's spent years being reminded to keep perfect posture." She paused before asking, "Amber, are you in the military?" I met her eyes. They were warm, steady, and familiar. I had seen that expression on countless military spouses over the years, people who had survived deployments, lonely holidays, and late-night phone calls from halfway around the world. They understood sacrifice because they had lived alongside it. "Ma'am," I replied, "I'm not going to lie to you at your daughter's engagement dinner." "Then don't. I'm a captain in the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps." She carefully lowered her coffee cup onto the saucer. "You're still serving?" "Yes, ma'am." "And your family introduced you as someone working in hotel management?" "It seems that way," I answered without sarcasm or anger. Just the truth, laid plainly between us. Donna slowly placed a hand against her chest. Her eyes drifted toward Lorraine, who was laughing across the room with Megan's cousin as though everything was perfectly normal. After a moment, she looked back at me. "Does Jim know?" "I think he's starting to figure it out." She gently squeezed my shoulder before standing. Then she walked across the room and leaned beside her husband, whispering quietly into his ear. Whatever she said lasted only a few seconds. The colonel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he calmly placed his coffee cup on the table, folded his napkin with precise movements, and rose to his feet. "I'd like to offer a toast before we finish this evening," he announced. The room instantly fell silent. Not the polite silence people fake during speeches, the genuine kind where forks stop moving and every conversation disappears mid-sentence. Across the table, Lorraine smiled confidently. Even from several seats away, I recognized that smile. It was the expression she'd been chasing all evening. She believed the colonel was about to congratulate Kyle and Megan, bless their future together, and validate everything she'd worked so hard to stage. This, she thought, was the reward. "I'd like to begin," the colonel said, with something a little different. He lifted his glass only to chest level. Anyone with military experience would recognize the signal. He hadn't raised it high enough for the toast to begin. He wasn't finished. "I served in the United States Army for 32 years, he said, his voice carrying naturally across the room. "And during that time, I learned something important." He paused just long enough for everyone to focus. "You can learn everything you need to know about a family simply by watching how they treat one another when they believe no one important is paying attention." The words settled heavily over the table. Lorraine's smile remained, but the confidence behind it started to crack. "Kyle, Megan." His tone softened as he looked toward the engaged couple. "I'm proud of both of you. Marriage demands planning, sacrifice, and commitment." He paused. "But above all else, it demands honesty." The final word landed with quiet authority, leaving no room for argument. "Tonight," he continued, "I'd like to say something about honesty." This time Lorraine's smile visibly faltered. Without another word, the colonel set his glass back on the table, pushed his chair away, and started walking. He didn't head toward the engaged couple. He didn't remain near the head of the table. Instead, he slowly made his way down the length of the room, passing guests, empty dessert plates, coffee cups, and folded napkins until he reached my end of the table. Every step seemed to make the room feel smaller. Lorraine turned to watch him. "Jem," she called, her voice noticeably tighter. "The kids are down at the other end." He never slowed. 5 steps. 6. 7. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, not from fear, but because I knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't a moment I had planned. I hadn't asked for it. I hadn't created it. It arrived because I chose to tell the truth when someone finally cared enough to ask. The colonel stopped directly in front of me. I looked up.
He looked down.
For 3 silent seconds, neither of us spoke. It lasted about as long as a formal salute, about as long as one steady breath before stepping forward. Hidden beneath the table, my fingers closed around the challenge coin resting inside my pocket, my thumb tracing the eagle engraved across its surface. The colonel smiled gently. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the entire room. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting to meet you here like this." "Good to see you again, Colonel," I replied in a calm, steady voice, the same tone I always used when the moment truly mattered. He gave a single nod before speaking loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear. "And who is this young woman to all of you?" The question struck the room like an unseen blast. For one suspended moment, everything froze. Just as with a distant explosion, the light reached everyone before the shockwave did. Every face turned. Lorraine was already halfway to her feet. She's my daughter, Jim. She works in. The colonel calmly lifted one hand. Open palm. Straight fingers. A simple military signal that needed no explanation. Lorraine stopped speaking instantly. Without taking his eyes off me, the colonel said, "Captain, would you please introduce yourself to everyone here? Your name and your unit." I rose from my chair. My shoulders naturally squared. I wasn't standing at attention. I wasn't wearing my uniform, but years of military discipline showed in every movement. Anyone watching could immediately tell the difference between someone who had learned posture at family dinners and someone trained to stand before commanding officers. "My name is Captain Amber Townsend," I said clearly. "I serve with the 3rd Quartermaster Battalion at Fort Campbell, Kentucky." Silence filled the room. Not awkward silence. Not uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that comes when reality suddenly changes and no one knows how to respond. Megan slowly turned toward Kyle. Her lips parted, but no words came.
Kyle stared at Lorraine.
Lorraine lowered her eyes to the tablecloth. The colonel then faced everyone. He didn't need to raise his voice. "I personally presented Captain Townsend with the Army Commendation Medal 3 years ago at Fort Campbell." Every person listened. She earned that recognition for exceptional service during Operation Resolute Support after managing supply operations for 3 forward operating bases in Helmand Province. He paused deliberately. Despite working under active combat conditions, not one essential shipment failed while she was responsible. Another heavy silence followed. "And tonight." He let the words hang for a moment. "Her own family introduced her to me as someone working in hotel management." The phrase landed like shattered glass. There was no repairing it. Around the room, expressions changed one after another. The colonel's friends stared at Lorraine. Megan's cousin slowly looked toward Kyle. Donna looked at me with eyes filled equally with admiration, heartbreak, and anger. Meanwhile, my mother, Lorraine Townsend, 58 years old, owner of a successful catering company, always dressed in pearls, always smelling of hairspray, always certain she controlled every room she entered. Now, she simply sat frozen. For what felt like the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing to say. Then everything unraveled. Lorraine pushed herself to her feet so quickly that her chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. "Jim, I think this is all just a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I never lied. I only simplified things for conversation. You know how dinner parties are. People don't want to hear about simplified." The colonel interrupted without even turning toward her. Still facing the room, he continued calmly. "Mrs. Townsend, you told my wife that your daughter had no real career." Donna finally spoke. Her voice remained soft, but every word landed with precision. "Your exact words were, 'She's been drifting.'" She looked directly at Lorraine. "And you also said she wasn't very ambitious." Lorraine's eyes immediately searched for Kyle. She wanted support. She wanted the son who always agreed with her. The son who never challenged her. The son who always stood beside her. But Kyle never looked up. His attention stayed fixed on his own hands resting beside his phone. The screen was still lit. The last message he'd sent me remained visible. "Please don't make this awkward." He couldn't even meet my eyes. Lorraine's voice cracked, not because she was crying, but because years of pressure were finally breaking through. "You don't understand our family, Colonel."
She pointed toward me.
"Amber left us. She walked away when I needed her the most. She chose the army instead of choosing her own mother. Now her carefully controlled image was falling apart piece by piece. Everything she had spent years hiding was surfacing. Something older. Something far more honest than the story she'd been telling all evening. But once it started, she didn't know how to stop. She never had." The colonel finally turned toward me. "Captain," he said quietly, "would you like to respond?" I slowly stood once more. At some point I'd sat back down without even realizing it, probably habit, maybe instinct. I looked around the table. At Megan, whose engagement dinner had become something none of us expected. At Kyle, still unable to look me in the eye. And finally at Donna, who now had tears quietly running down her face. I looked around the room. Donna sat silently, tears sliding down her cheeks without a sound. Beside me stood Colonel Harland, steady as ever, like a witness, waiting to testify. Finally, my eyes settled on Lorraine. I enlisted in the United States Army when I was 18. I began. My voice stayed calm and deliberate, the same voice I used when briefing senior officers, where every sentence mattered and there was no room for unnecessary words. At 22, I earned my commission through Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. Since then, I've completed 2 deployments to Afghanistan and 1 to Kuwait. I paused only long enough to breathe. I've coordinated military supply operations in combat zones where reinforcements were nothing more than a helicopter ride away and a prayer. I've watched soldiers leave for missions knowing some would never make it home. Silence settled over the table. My mother told all of you I work in hotel management. I looked directly at Lorraine. She said I've been drifting through life. For 14 years, she's repeated that same story. To neighbors, to Kyle's friends, and now to everyone sitting here tonight. I held her gaze. I didn't come here to expose you, Mom. I came because Kyle is my brother, and I'm deploying again in 60 days. I just wanted to see him before I left. That's the only reason I drove 7 hours. When I finished, I sat back down. Both hands rested flat on the table. My fingers stayed perfectly still. I had said everything that needed saying. Lorraine gripped the back of her chair as though it were the only thing keeping her standing. Her lips moved, but no words came. She reminded me of an old building moments before collapse, still upright, yet already hollow inside. Without making a scene, she quietly stepped away from the table. No shouting. No slammed doors. She simply folded her napkin onto the table and walked into the hallway. A few seconds later, I followed. Not to argue, not to humiliate her, but because, for the first time in 14 years, I'd seen something unfamiliar on her face. Real fear. Not the polished anxiety she displayed over seating charts or table settings. Something genuine. She stood near the restroom hallway, leaning against the wall. Her hands trembled openly now. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Slowly, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small laminated photograph. The edges were worn smooth from years of being handled. Even before I clearly saw it, I recognized it. I'd once found that same picture hidden inside a drawer years earlier. It was a photograph of my grandmother as a young nurse. Her hair was pinned neatly back, and her expression carried both hope and goodbye in equal measure. "She left when I was 11, Lorraine whispered. She said she needed to find herself. She moved to Richmond and became a nurse. She never came back. No birthday calls. No explanations. Nothing. When she left, she was younger than you are now. Her voice barely sounded like her own anymore. She said she had to go. She believed it mattered." Lorraine gently ran her thumb across the old photograph. "When you enlisted, I saw her. I saw my mother in your face. The same eyes. The same certainty. The same feeling that the door was closing." I looked at her quietly. "So, you made sure I had nothing waiting for me if I ever came back." She never answered. She simply stood there holding the picture of the woman who abandoned her. A daughter wounded by someone who left. A mother unable to forgive that wound. And in the process, she punished her own daughter for committing the very same imagined betrayal. Without another word, I returned to the dining room. When I sat back down, Colonel Harland was once again standing at the head of the table. He hadn't rushed anyone. He'd simply waited. Not because he was patient, because he understood timing. "I'd like to finish my toast," he said. No one objected. No one even moved. A moment later, Lorraine quietly returned and took her seat. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes stayed fixed on the tablecloth, as though staring at a document she already knew she'd signed without reading. "A few moments ago," the colonel continued, "I said marriage depends on honesty. So does family." He paused. "And tonight I've learned this family has a daughter who served her country with honor and a mother who chose to erase that service simply to impress people she barely knows. The words landed with the certainty of a judge delivering a final verdict. Lorraine visibly flinched. Not just her face. Her entire body reacted. Across the table, Kyle gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Megan looked at him with an expression that silently asked a question neither of them was ready to answer. "The only embarrassment I've witnessed tonight," the colonel said calmly, "is a mother who denied her own daughter service." He lifted his glass. "To Kyle and Megan. May your marriage always be built on truth, especially when the truth is difficult." He took a drink. Donna followed. "So did I." Kyle slowly raised his glass with an unsteady hand. Lorraine never touched hers. When the toast ended, Colonel Harland walked back toward me one final time. He stopped beside my chair. Everything else in the room seemed to fade away. "Captain Townsend," he said, "I remember your medal ceremony very well. You had just returned from a 12-month deployment in Helmand Province. You were responsible for keeping 3 forward operating bases supplied with fuel, food, medical equipment, and ammunition under combat conditions that would have overwhelmed most people." He paused thoughtfully. "When I pinned that medal on your uniform, you told me something I wrote down later that evening." He smiled slightly. "You said, 'It isn't about receiving recognition, sir. It's about getting the mission done.'" He let those words settle. "But tonight, you deserve to be recognized." He extended his hand toward me. I shook it. His grip was firm.
Warm. Steady.
It lasted only a few seconds. Then Donna stepped forward and gently rested a hand on my shoulder. She gave it a single reassuring squeeze, the kind that says everything words never could. Donna rested a gentle hand on my shoulder. That single touch expressed more than words ever could. "A mother," she said softly, "should be the very first person to tell the world who her daughter truly is." As she spoke, her eyes settled on Lorraine. There was no anger in them, only something far more painful. Compassion. "I'm sorry yours never did." I gave a slight nod. My throat tightened and tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of this room. It wasn't because tears meant weakness. I'd cried before, alone at 3 in the morning on a forward operating base after a convoy had been attacked. But those tears belonged to moments that deserved them. This room didn't. Just like my years of service belonged to me. Just like my name belonged to me. I turned toward Lorraine. She remained seated, both hands folded tightly in her lap, her fingers locked together until her knuckles had turned pale. Her pearl necklace had shifted off-center. Her makeup was still flawless, yet beneath it the woman herself looked shattered. The calm, polished image she'd protected for years had finally cracked from within. "I kept quiet, Mom," I said. "For 14 years. The colonel didn't." She parted her lips as if to answer, then stopped. She tried again. "Nothing." "I'm not angry," I continued. "I'm not going to make a scene or scream at you in front of everyone. That's never been who I am." I paused before finishing. "But you need to hear this. I'm done pretending to be the daughter you wanted instead of accepting the daughter you actually have." I lifted my purse from the back of the chair. Then I reached into my dress pocket and removed the challenge coin. For a moment I held it in my palm, feeling its familiar weight, the eagle engraved on one side, my battalion's crest on the other. Then I set it gently on the table in front of Lorraine. "Colonel Harland gave me this," I said quietly. "The same day, he presented me with the medal you've never once asked about." I slid it toward her.
"Keep it.
"Maybe next time you introduce me, it'll remind you who I really am." I smoothed my dress and looked around the room. Kyle stood near the doorway, his jaw clenched, eyes shining with tears. Megan watched him with the uncertain expression of someone questioning everything she thought she knew. Finally, I met the colonel's eyes. He gave me one simple nod. That was enough. I turned and walked away. Out of the private dining room. Down the hallway lined with burgundy carpet and softly glowing wall sconces. Through the restaurant entrance. Into the cool Virginia night. The parking lot was only half full. Beyond it, The Blue Ridge Mountains stood as dark silhouettes beneath a deep navy sky. The air carried the scent of cedar and warm asphalt, while faint music, clinking dishes, and distant conversations drifted through the restaurant doors behind me. Life inside continued as though nothing had happened. As I reached my rental car, I heard footsteps behind me. "Amber, wait." I turned. Kyle stood beneath one of the parking lot lights. His tie had been loosened, his face flushed. Somehow he looked both much younger than 28 and far older than I'd ever seen him. "Don't leave like this." I looked at him. "Like what, Kyle?" He swallowed hard. "I didn't know Mom told them all of that. I mean, I knew she stretched the truth sometimes, but I never realized she'd invented an entirely different life for you." "You knew enough," I answered. He frowned. "You told me not to mention the Army. You told Megan I'd just been traveling. Maybe your lie wasn't as big as Mom's, but you still helped carry it." "I was only trying to protect." "Protect what?" I cut him off. "Your insurance pitch to her father?" He had no answer. His mouth opened, closed again. He stared at the pavement, studying the cracks in the asphalt as though they were easier to face than I was. "Kyle," I said quietly, "I love you. You'll always be my brother. But I can't keep playing the role of the family embarrassment when I've done nothing to be ashamed of." Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were red. His chin trembled. "When you're ready to know who I actually am instead of the version Mom created." I paused. "You know exactly where to find me. Fort Campbell, 3rd Quartermaster Battalion." "I'm not hiding." I climbed into the car, shut the door, and started the engine. As I drove away, he remained standing beneath that parking lot light, watching until my taillights disappeared into the darkness. Later, I found out what happened after I left. Megan pulled Kyle aside near the corner of the dining room. Her voice stayed calm, but every word carried the firmness of someone raised in a military household. "You told me your sister was drifting through life, Kyle. She's a captain in the United States Army." "You're a captain in the United States Army," Megan said, disbelief filling her voice. "You lied to me." Kyle shook his head quickly. "I didn't lie. I let Mom tell the story." Megan looked him straight in the eyes. "That is lying." Without waiting for another excuse, she turned and walked back to her father's side. Kyle remained where he was, standing alone near the bread station. His eyes drifted toward the chair I had occupied only minutes earlier, then to the challenge coin resting untouched in front of Lorraine's untouched glass. The last person to speak that evening was Colonel Harland. He stood with his hands relaxed at his sides and faced Lorraine directly. "Mrs. Townsend," he began calmly, "I respect your son. I care deeply about my daughter, and I sincerely hope the best for your family." He paused. "But there is something I need to say." The room stayed silent. During my career, I've commanded thousands of soldiers. I can say without hesitation that Captain Amber Townsend is someone I would trust with the lives of my own troops. He looked directly at Lorraine. "The fact that you failed to recognize that isn't her failure. It's yours." No one answered. Lorraine remained seated after everyone else had fallen quiet. Servers cleared dessert plates around her while conversations slowly resumed in whispers. The white roses she'd arranged so carefully only a few hours earlier had already begun to droop. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She simply sat there with the challenge coin resting in her hand, turning it over slowly as though it belonged to a world she'd never understood. I stayed inside my rental car for nearly 5 minutes before pulling out of the parking lot. The engine idled. The headlights illuminated the pavement ahead. Beyond the windshield, the Blue Ridge Mountains stretched across the horizon like a postcard from a hometown that no longer felt like mine. Then my phone rang. "Donna, Harland." "Captain Townsend," she said gently, "I just wanted to make sure you're doing all right." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Harland. I'm okay." A brief silence followed. Not an awkward one. A warm one. Finally, she spoke again. "What you did tonight, the restraint you showed, the dignity you kept while your own mother." She stopped herself, then tried again. "That took more courage than anything I've witnessed at a dinner table." She laughed softly. "And I've attended more dinner functions than I can count." "Thank you, ma'am." "For whatever it's worth, she continued. "Jem and I would be honored to have you sitting at our table anytime." She emphasized the last word. Anytime. I closed my eyes. Coming from a woman who had spent 30 years beside military service, sharing every deployment, every farewell, every homecoming, that invitation meant more than every compliment my own mother had withheld over the previous 14 years. Not because Donna Harland held influence, because she spoke the truth. "I'll never forget that, ma'am," I replied quietly. "Thank you." After we ended the call, I remained in the silence a little longer. One final glance into the rearview mirror showed the restaurant still glowing behind me. People were still inside, still trying to make sense of an evening that had begun as an engagement celebration and ended with a family's carefully constructed lives falling apart. I shifted the car into drive. The 7-hour trip back to Fort Campbell began. I left the radio off. Silence was enough. Somewhere along Interstate 81 between Roanoke and the Tennessee state line, I spoke aloud even though no one was there to hear it. I finally know exactly who I am to them. And more importantly, I know who I am without them. The highway stretched endlessly ahead.
Dark.
Straight. Completely my own. 3 weeks later, I was back at Fort Campbell. Morning briefings. Logistics meetings. Supply reports.
Deployment planning.
The familiar rhythm of military life settled around me once again, holding me together the way it always had. Kyle called twice. I answered the second call. He apologized. Not completely. Not deeply enough to erase the past, but enough to crack open a door that had been closed for years. "Megan made me tell her everything," he admitted. "About the Army, about your deployments, and about everything Mom has been saying all these years." He sighed. "She told me if I couldn't be truthful about my own sister, she'd never be able to trust me about anything else." They were still engaged, but Megan had made one thing perfectly clear. If Kyle wanted to marry her, he first had to rebuild his relationship with me. On my terms. Not his. Not our mother's.
Mine.
Lorraine never called. I wasn't surprised. Silence had always been her way of dealing with truths she couldn't control. It was the same pattern her own mother had left behind. She never recognized how closely she'd become the person who hurt her. For the first time in 14 years, I didn't chase after her. I didn't call. I didn't apologize. I didn't try to repair damage I hadn't caused. I left the silence exactly where it belonged. With her. A few days later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Cream-colored stationery. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note in the neat, disciplined handwriting of a man who had signed thousands of official orders during his career. It read, "Captain, your service brings honor to all of us. Never allow anyone to diminish what you've earned." I pinned the note to the corkboard above my desk beside my deployment orders. Every morning before work, I saw both. One reminded me of my duty. The other reminded me of my worth. For 14 years, I allowed my mother's version of me to become the only version anyone ever heard. Then, during one dinner in Roanoke, Virginia, a retired colonel asked a single honest question. That question changed everything. Because I learned something I'll never forget. The people who truly value you never ask you to hide who you are just to make themselves comfortable. That is my story. One late-night phone call, one engagement dinner, and one retired colonel who finally spoke the words my own mother never could. If this story reminded you that your service, whatever form it takes, still matters, even when the people closest to you fail to recognize it, share this video with someone who needs that reminder today. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.